Hello, welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. My guest today is coming to us from Philadelphia, is that right, Dean?
Yes.
All the way from Philadelphia. And he is a man who defines his professional life as an environmental engineer. And he's going to explain what that is and what that means, especially the word environment. That's an important one, isn't it, Dean?
Definitely.
And so why don't you tell us what an environmental engineer is and does?
So environmental engineer is a person who is working with companies or for a regulatory agency to monitor how things are made to make sure the environment is protected, or if they're supporting a company that's making things, or the environmental engineers inside a company, whether it's a refinery or a pharmaceutical company or yogurt manufacturer, they have to make sure things are produced in such a way that there aren't harmful emissions or releases of toxic chemicals, and that waste is done. And also today, environmental engineers work to make sure those things are done as efficiently and as sustainable as possible. That's a real important part. Traditionally, environmental engineers were sanitary engineers and making sure that people had clean water and that the wastewater being discharged was clean. And over time, that the functions of environmental engineers have started to include air pollution control and hazardous waste management and sustainable engineering, energy efficiency, and all kinds of fun things.
Well, you told me that when we talked that you didn't start out as an environmental engineer, that your life has been a journey. Where did you start out, and how did you get to where you are today?
I started out with the fortunate condition that I wanted to be a marine biologist, but I knew that at the age of 6. And I said fortunate because I know after having 2 children that that's not everybody. You know, everybody doesn't know what they want to be as they go through college and everything. And I wanted to be a marine biologist all through high school, all through grade school, high school, college. And it was only after I got out of college when I realized that being a marine biologist also meant being on a ship for a long, long period of time, doing research. And at that point in my life, a newlywed, I was not interested in being on a vessel far out at sea for 2 years at a shot. I ended up taking a position as a pollution control inspector in Miami, Florida, because all through my understanding of marine science, I was also learning about the impacts of pollution on the marine ecosystem. So environmental protection was important to me, and I ended up as pollution control inspector in Dade County, Florida, Miami, and finding things that needed to be fixed, spilled pesticides and whatnot. And I would take them back to the agency, and then they would turn the problem over to the environmental engineers, who were the ones that went out and fixed it. So I decided I needed to get my engineering degree and went back to school for environmental engineering. And since then, it's been just a lot of fun working with a lot of different industries and as a consultant or as an environmental engineer inside different businesses.
So it really was a journey then.
Yes.
Especially if you start at the age of 6. How did you even know what a marine biologist was at the age of 6? How is that possible?
At the age of 6, there was 2 things happened. I still have the memory, it's still vivid. My mom took me to an aquarium in Florida when we were living there. And I remember a manta ray sweeping past the window of the aquarium with its huge black wing, just gracefully gliding across the glass. And I was just so moved. And then also, then in the late 60s and early 70s, Jacques Cousteau was regularly doing shows, and those were quite impressionable. So I just fell in love with the whole thing and kept up with, learned how to scuba dive and did all that, and spent a full semester at Duke University's Marine Lab, and just, just one of those things. And I still am fascinated by it. I love it, but started to do the environmental engineering side of things.
Isn't that interesting? Yes. Well, many lives are journeys, but not everyone finds themselves as an environmental engineer. Tell us something about what sort of problems are coming up that you're trying to help, and how do you help them?
So right now, I spend most of my time providing the environmental engineering support for compliance engineering support for 4 large power plants. They're natural gas power plants. They're recently built. And it's been interesting to see how, as they manage their compliance programs, their owners require no violations. They're all owned by independent power producers, basically private equity. And their goal is to make sure that their asset is as valuable as possible all the time. So they have zero tolerance for any kind of violations. So that is always a challenge, and it's a constant educational effort to the staff, because a lot of times the way the operators and mechanics and contractors come on site, their focus is to keep the power plant running. And there's always turnover. Especially with contractors. So it's always, constant education, reminding them, all right, this is a stormwater drain. Don't put anything down that. And then if there is an incident, then responding to it as quickly as possible. And so that's a big part of what I'm trying to do, is make sure that those facilities all stay in compliance. And they do. They have very good records. The other part of it is all the states that they're in have different environmental they have different environmental requirements, I would say emphasis. So in Texas, there's a very, very strong emphasis in air pollution control. They want to make sure that even if the site is painting, doing routine maintenance painting, that there's a limit of how many pounds of volatile organic compounds can be released from the painting project without having to submit for permits and those kind of things, which is very different from Ohio, where they don't have to keep track of those kind of issues. So helping everybody understand their particular issues to stay on top of it. And then to take it to the next step beyond compliance, so to speak, how do they do what they're doing in a sustainable manner? And fortunately, the owners, as well as the company that I support that operates the plants, have learned the value of sustainable engineering. If you think of pollution as the release of either a raw material that you just bought, but you didn't use it right, so you've released it, so that's wasting money, or it's the release of an incomplete chemical reaction or production process, so again, you're wasting your raw material and potential for your product, or it's just a release of your product that you made. You didn't keep it. So that's all money. And many companies have started to realize that sustainability is also a very good business practice. So you're starting to see an effort there. So I'm getting a chance now to incorporate those ideas into the day-to-day operations. And so a lot of really fun ways, like how do we reduce water use at a power plant? If you think of what happens at a power plant, you're burning a fossil fuel and you're creating steam and you're making electricity. So the main product, the main raw materials for a power plant are fuel and water. You need water because you got to make steam. So you have to conserve water. And where does that water come from? Well, you got to pay for it. Where does that water go? Some discharge it to a wastewater plant, and you got to pay for that discharge to the city. So again, if you can change your process, reduce how much water you use, reduce how much chemicals you use, you save money, you impact the environment in a beneficial way. So I'm helping to guide the companies in those areas as well.
So you're bringing together two forces that normally don't live together, correct? I mean,
Yes.
the idea of saving money is also a way of keeping money, but saving money at the same time, which is something that is more respectful of the environment. That's not the usual story, is it?
That hasn't been for many years, all through my career, a good chunk of it. But I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years, you're starting to see companies understand that. So 20 years ago, a few companies understood it. Companies I had a fortune was able to work with some. Johnson & Johnson understood it. Danone or Stonyfield Farms, they both understood it and still understand it. But now a number of other companies have picked it up, so much so that if you're looking at who's hiring for environmental managers, environmental engineers, let's call them sustainability officers. Many companies have sustainability managers now. Part of what their job requirements are is that they have an MBA. So they could have a science background and have an environmental background, could be environmental science, environmental engineering, but they also need to have an MBA because they've started to realize that sustainability, sustainable engineering is a big part of staying in business, staying profitable, because you have a business risk if you're not managing your raw materials and your product as efficiently as possible.
Well, you know, what's so interesting about your story is that you're actually putting environmentally friendly behavior and connecting it with good business. That is not the way people have been looking at this or seeing this. How do we, go on?
No, go ahead. You're right. That's all I was going to say. Yes, you're correct.
You keep saying that. But I think that in our struggle for looking at climate change, our concerns about what's happening to water and to air quality, how can we get this message through to other companies, to businesses, and to the citizens of the place who need to feel comforted that their companies are watching out for their well-being?
I think more of what's been going on. There has to be more education in college and in high school around environmental programs, and especially in engineering. And I do see it. This is how you need to do proper engineering. You need to account for environmental health and safety. And then more regulations or continued regulations to ensure that companies that are going to take shortcuts don't, because there are still companies that take shortcuts. That's unfortunate, but that is just the way it is. And I think also more research, just somehow getting more research around energy efficiency, water use. And a lot of that was happening 10, 15 years ago. A lot of the money that went into those kind of projects has gone away to other things. So EPA used to do a lot of really interesting research. Department of Energy used to do a lot of really interesting research. And a lot of that it's just not there anymore. And I think if there was more research around how to impact in a positive way how industries do business, that would be good. I think the other thing that is hopeful to get the message out to companies, and I'm seeing this more, is that many companies are doing things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, other environmental scorecards, or environmental, social, and governance scorecards, ESG. If they're an international company, their investors are looking to see what their score is across the board for environmental, social, and governance. And social and governance includes safety of employees, workplace safety, freedom to unionize, diversity, inclusion, board diversity? Do you have bonuses based on environmental health and safety goals? So you're seeing a lot more of that. And the power plants that I'm supporting, all of the owners are very much in making sure that their companies have high scores, that their assets, their power plants have high ESG scores. So that's another way it can happen. And then the social, the non-government organizations, taking active roles in board, owning shares of companies, or buying up NOx allocations as part of the air pollution program. The acid rain permitting program. So there are ways that environmental groups can literally buy NOx emissions. So there's allowances of how much NOx and how much SOx, or sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, that you can emit. And you can buy them up and bank them and never sell them, so that they start coming off the table. And that has been very effective. Many years ago, when there was acid rain and the lakes in the Northeast were being acidified, that's when the acid rain program started. And that's been a big success. The amount of acid rain has drastically reduced. The lakes are rebounding. So there's ways, just those messages need to get out to people more, that it has to happen. And the message has to be repeated every generation. It's just the way I've learned that over the years, unfortunately. But I guess why not? Everything has to be taught again. It's just because, some of this stuff doesn't become what do you call it, cultural memory, I guess. Some does, some doesn't. Unfortunately, good environmental health and safety practices are not yet at the point where they're cultural memory, but maybe they'll get there.
Very, very interesting, because when I mentioned this, and I mentioned this upcoming show with you to people, they had no idea what I was talking about. And it's not because they're unintelligent, certainly not, but because it's unknown.
Right.
And this is the problem. How do we get people to become aware of this so that they can participate perhaps in a more helping way?
I think businesses on one hand need to do more to get students, high school students in, college students in maybe. The power plants I'm supporting, they've got a program where they get the local high school environmental class to come out and do stream sampling at the stream where they're discharging. So they're in a creative process to teach students so they understand. And then it's teaching the next generation. And the existing generation, I don't have an answer for that. I guess conversations like this.
That's why we're doing it. That's
right.
Why it's so important for us to be talking to each other today. Yeah, this is, I'm a writer on environmental issues. I'm a sociologist. I've written several books, including one called Environmental Decision Making in Rural Locales in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and then The Politics of Offshore Oil. I wrote a book about offshore oil. I served on a White House advisory committee on offshore oil leasing. So I, of course, am interested in this. And you're telling me something that I need to hear, which is since I'm still teaching, college teaching, these things that we need to get students to be thinking about, to be working on, to be reading about. What would you suggest? What would be a good way to approach them?
I read a book. It was my first book by John McPhee, but it was provided as I was a young engineer, environmental engineer, and our senior managers, senior engineers, formed a great books of management club. And one of the assigned readings was Encounters with the Arch Druid. And it's a book where McPhee went around with David Brower, one of the founding members of Sierra Club, and they interviewed 3 key people involved in things you wouldn't necessarily consider being environmentally friendly. So he interviewed the head of the dams and recreation in the West, while they're building a lot of these big dams, interviewed a copper mining engineer, I believe it was, and then interviewed the person who was developing the very first set of homes, or what was called Sea Pines Plantation, on the then untouched Hilton Head Island in South Carolina. But the way McPhee wove everything in was, there's trade-offs that are being made. If we want to keep being, a growing democratic society, if you will, there's reasons why we make trades and trade-offs to protect the environment, but also to keep providing for people. We need copper. If we don't try to develop Sea Pines Plantation in an environmentally friendly way, we know sure as heck that someone's gonna come in here and just raise trees and build big apartments. So McPhee, what I thought was important was providing, he wasn't banging on people's head, you must be environmentalist. And he wasn't banging on people saying you need to look at industrialists, we need to keep growing. It was, this is complicated, we need to think about it. So I found that be a good book, the way to open up the door to think about it, whether you agreed all one way or all the other. And then also understanding getting people to understand some of the history of, like you were talking about with, the Pine Barrens and the impact there. Understanding that these decisions were made at a different time and for different reasons. And I don't have a good book on that necessarily. I mean, maybe that's just stories that other people tell. My father-in-law talked about, he was telling me the reason for the creation of the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. And, I always like putting all the dams on the Tennessee Valley River down there. I was like, that was just ridiculous. This is me thinking in the 80s. And he was saying, no, when they built those dams, because there was massive flooding going on all through the Southeast, and they needed to control the flooding. And while they're controlling the flooding, go ahead and build electrical generation as well. So you just reach out and read whatever you can, but don't just read one-sided stuff. You kind of got to read the more encompassing stuff, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, those are very good thoughts. Actually, I did, as I recall, interview John McPhee. I went down and met him and talked with him about my book on the Pine Barrens, because he had written a book about the Pine Barrens, and that was my doctoral dissertation.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and my first book.
Okay.
It certainly, the story of the Pine Barrens was that the land which had been farming land, had been agricultural. They were now, the farmers didn't have that much, or they had a lot of land, and they could sell it for housing. So what you had was a transition from the use of land for farming to the use of land to create housing and building housing complexes. And that changed the whole agricultural and ecological nature of that region. And that was what I found, and that's what I was writing about. But like a good sociologist, I went down and interviewed the farmers and the piney people. And I remember one man who was a piney, what they call piney, and he said, I built my own cabin. And would you like to see it? And I said, yeah. So I followed him through the woods, and he shows me this log cabin. And this was a cabin that he had built and that he was living in. And so this was a way of life that was rural, that people didn't know about. And that, I think, is what we need to grasp, is that we not only change land use, but we also change the way people live as a result.
Yes.
And life changes.
Yes.
And this is what, people don't understand the impact of creating these different types of industries and how it affects people's lives. and the way they live. And I do remember visiting one farmer who had a very large farm, and he drove me in a Jeep all around the farm. And finally he stopped and said, "Want some lunch?" I said, "Yeah." So he took me back to the farmhouse where his wife had made us a nice lunch. And he talked to me, and I had wonderful interviews with people in my book. I think that what we're both talking about is how it is that life can be affected by the decisions that people make. And what is their sense of responsibility towards these decisions that they make?
Yes. I've been watching with fascination what's playing out the four corners of the US. That I forgot which 4 states it is, but there's a huge coal-fired power plant that has been there forever. And at some point, members of the Navajo Nation were able to get together and take ownership of that project and of the coal mine that fed it as a way of having agency over their own area, because the plant was on a lot of their land. Apparently the mine was on a lot of their land, and then also employ their people and keep them going. But they're having to shut that plant down, if it's not shut down already just this last year. So now they're grappling of the impacts of, like you're saying, how does this impact us? Some of the members of the peoples liked having, realized the challenge of operating a coal-fired power plant and the impacts, but at the same time, they need the resource for their own living conditions. And then others didn't want it to run, and now it's not running. And how do they transition? Because there is no other source of income out there.
Right.
And it's just a hard place to be. And so many economies at the moment are looking that way. A lot of the coal mining region, Appalachia is having a hard time with that.
Well, Dean Ritts, it's been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed talking with you because you and I are somewhat on the same page, but coming from very different directions. But nevertheless, I'm not an engineer and you're not a sociologist, but apparently we can still communicate about
Definitely.
things that matter to both of us. And thank you so much, Dean Ritts, coming all the way from Philadelphia to be on my TV show, Backstory, with Joan Goldstein. Thanks so much, Dean Ritts.
Thank you, Joan.
Goodbye.